Hello, friends. Brian with City the Immaculata, back with you. I have a first here. I have a returning guest. So, last time, for those of you that may not have caught it, I would recommend you go back and watch the first time that Avellina had joined us, and she and I were kind of on a roll. It's always a bit of a challenge with these I guess I could go the Joe Rogan route and make it like a 5 hour all day event, but I
Do an
instead choose to,
extravaganza.
yeah, but I instead, try to keep these around an hour, maybe push the 2 hour mark. But we kind of both decided that there was more to discuss. So again, go back, watch that first video. For those of you that didn't, though, Avellina Balestri is a Catholic author and editor from the historical borderlands of Maryland and Pennsylvania. Her stories, poems, and essays have been featured in over 30 print and online publications. Prior to Gone for a Soldier, she published two books, Saplings of Sherwood, the first in a Robin Hood retelling series, and Pendragon Shield, a collection of poetry. She is the editor in chief of Fellowship and Fairy Dust magazine, inspiring faith and creativity and exploring the arts through the spiritual lens. Under the auspices, Under its auspices, she has hosted two literary conferences, one at Oxford University and the other at Cambridge University. And she has also represented the state of Maryland at the Sons of the American Revolution National Orations Contest in Greenville, South Carolina. Avellina believes in that the Trinitarian divine dance and incarnational indwelling mystery are reflected in all things good, true, and beautiful, and that the image of God is wondrously woven into every human heart. These themes are at the forefront of the stories she chooses to tell. Avellina, welcome back.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me on again.
So, for this time around, I thought we could kind of hover around maybe the 12th century and the 13th century,
Mhm.
one of my favorite time periods. And we could kind of hone in on one of my favorite places during this time period. Since we had been kind of discussing England at length today, I thought it
Mhm.
would be nice just to kind of do a little bit more of a deep dive. And I
I'm
was
always
thinking of,
game to discuss some other country. So,
well, I was thinking about kind of like where's the best place to begin with, and I think we'll just do like the typical thing, which is it's typical because it's rather helpful. Maybe we can sort of begin by looking at the sort of defining people of this period, which would, in my opinion, be probably King Henry II and Richard I.
Mhm.
And for maybe like a little bit of context, we're several decades removed from the Norman conquest. The old Anglo-Saxon state and its apparatuses and the episcopate have been replaced with what is basically a contingent of the French aristocracy who are running at least the administrative side of things. So, can you maybe speak a little bit, Avellina, about kind of what's happening in the courts, particularly around Henry, and then leading into the reign of his son Richard?
well, sure. I guess a way in which I can do it is maybe to sort of focus on some of the elements that have come out in my Robin Hood series because it is very grounded in this whole time frame. So maybe what I'll do is sort of just talk about some of the elements that I pull out in the series, pull out in the first novel that is published, Saplings of Sherwood. So in terms of England at this time period, there was a great deal of, things being in flux, the English identity still sort of coming into being in the aftermath of, as you say, the Norman conquest is defining events really, because the Battle of Hastings was only the beginning of all of these sort of elements of Norman culture, law, architecture, hierarchy becoming dominant in England, and sort of Norman conquests in a sense of different aspects of English society, which previously had been predominantly Anglo-Saxon with some mix going on. However, when you get to the elements, when you think about it, I guess it's one of these things that historians have often commented recently, that it's not always black and white with these conquests or expulsions. There's always gray areas. So when we think about, for example, the, ancient Britons, the Celtic tribes, the Romano Celts and everything like that, we think of them, King Arthur, the real, if there is a real King Arthur, he would have been from that era. But we think of these people being essentially pushed out to the west, to what is now Wales and Cornwall and places like that. And some of them ending up in, across the channel in what becomes Brittany, which, has the term the Britons. We think of them being generally pushed out, and the Anglo-Saxons are the ones that replace them. Well, it's a little bit more complicated. Yes, there were people who were pushed out, pushed to the fringes and so forth, of both Britain and also ending up again on the continent. But you also had a lot of people who just ended up getting subliminated essentially by the dominant culture that came in, but they remained. And so you got a lot of, interbreeding essentially, where a lot of people do still have this sort of, Celtic or, Romano-British blood in them, even as they intermarry and so forth with the dominant Saxons, and the Saxon culture becomes dominant, even though the Saxons themselves are affected by the people that they conquer. It's kind of the flow of things. And this is true when you get down to it beforehand, because the Celts too were conquered, earlier on from previous tribes. You get the whole Neolithic peoples that go back beyond our ability to really pinpoint them. But these are the people mainly responsible for the stone circles, famous throughout the British Isles and so forth. We don't know much about them, but again, you have this element that their their connection to the people who then end up taking over remains. Like, there's a lot of, again, interbreeding and so forth, and cultures that are changed even when they're the conquering culture. So all this to say, it's the same with every group that comes in. So when you get the Anglo-Saxons become the dominant power, well, they're, Norse cousins, essentially, the Norsemen that you end up hearing so much in the stories of Alfred the Great and Edmund the Martyr and so forth. Well, these people, they end up, with the Danelaw, which is a part of England, which actually Nottinghamshire makes up part of the Danelaw, which is something that will come up in my books as well, these elements of that culture that become, prominent in those areas, and even prominent in other areas where Saxons still are basically, still in a position of power, but inevitably the presence of the Norsemen influenced and affected all sorts of things within England. And you had Norse kings during the various time periods. You think of Canute, the famous one, who is, supposedly commanding the sea to go back, commanding the tides to go back. And we now think he was actually making a point with that. He was trying to show, no, I can't actually do that. And then and everybody sort of remembers him as being a fool or something, but he was trying to potentially make a statement like, look, even a king cannot command the waves. But anyway, you get all of that, those layers already, and then you get the Normans. So the Normans, they are a mixed people. They are, descended from the Norsemen, who end up cutting a deal essentially with the Frankish, and the Christian Franks, and basically saying, hey, if you guys will settle in this region, which becomes Normandy, and you become Christian, and you stop raiding us, we will essentially send you various things. We'll let you have that strip of land, and we'll also send you wine and women, our French women, essentially, and you adopt our language, and there will be a mesh. And so that's how essentially the Normans come about. They're basically a Norse-Frankish hybrid people, of that overlay of like the French ways, what we would call French, back then, Frankish ways becoming dominant. But them still having predominantly Norse blood, but having intermixed with some of the French women who were sent to them. And so you get them. They become Christian, and they become quite a powerhouse for conquest. Not just in England. We think mostly the Norman conquest in England and some of the wider British Isles, but they were everywhere. You think of them popping up in Sicily and all over the place. They were quite a force to be reckoned with at the time as a distinct entity. So you get the Normans in 1066, under William the Conqueror, because at the death of Edward the Confessor, the saint, there was a dispute about who actually was supposed to inherit the throne. Was it Harold Godwinson, the Saxon claimant, the brother-in-law of the king, or was it his relation William of Normandy, also called William the Bastard by his not exactly supporters. And he would take that kind of thing very to heart, and he had a few instances of like skinning people alive, little things like that, when when they would mock him about that, he called him the bastard son of a tanner, etc., etc. So Tanner's daughter, whatnot. It definitely could get ugly quickly when pressed in that direction. So so that was that was William's situation, and of course he ends up winning at Hastings. It has a great little story about William taking a bit of a tumble, taking a fall when he's stepping out of the boat in England, and everybody thinks at first, oh, it's a bad omen. But then he grabs a handful of dirt and is like, no, that the earth is calling to its king or something, and he like reverses it and makes it as if he's saying it's a good omen. It's a good omen, actually. And so that's what begins, the Norman ascent. It becomes the ascendancy. It replaces both secular and religious authorities that had been, again, predominantly Saxon in England, and replaces them almost entirely with Normans. And to this day, the majority of aristocratic families have Norman ancestry, and so it was very much of a shift. But just like every other previous conquest, the people that they have conquered inevitably start to affect them as well and change their own culture and so forth within England. So that's just sort of the setup, I suppose. I just gave a kind of a quick setup leading into what becomes various kind of various struggles of the Norman nobles and the Norman royals as to who exactly is going to end up running the show among themselves in England. And that's when you get like wars, for example, between Stephen and Matilda, and the anarchy, and they call it, and so forth. And you have these conflicts between different claimants to the English throne that ultimately results in Matilda's son, Henry, coming to the throne as sort of a compromise. This is Henry II, who ends up coming to the throne in order to balance all this out. And he sort of is the formidable figure in the House Plantagenet, and so that sort of brings us up to that point.
So it's a with like Henry II. I mean, we could easily go into you have his issues around the episcopate with Thomas Becket, who was going to have such lasting, at least on the psyche of the English up until the Reformation, such a lasting impact. And but I think it's maybe even before that, like kind of taking a step back from it, because Becket himself was a part of a wider reform that was taking place called the Cluniac reforms, which was happening as a result of what was taking place on the mainland, the continent, which is the Abbey of Cluny was left a charter by a William of Aquitaine. And this charter basically makes it an independent monastery, not tied to any certain nobility. It's actually the charter hands it actually to the papacy, which the papacy at this point was kind of in its own dire straits, sort of wrapped up in local factionalism with the Roman nobility. And so as a result, this reform kind of sweeps across the continent, and it ultimately ends up coming to the papacy itself through figures like Pope Saint Leo the Ninth and Pope Saint Gregory the Seventh, excuse me, and then the subsequent Gregorian reforms, which would come to shape so much of medieval Europe. And so that is kind of in the backdrop to all of this, I guess you could say. It's maybe in the fore in so much as like the sort of power struggle between Henry and Thomas of Becket that's taking place is part of this wider Gregorian reform about the role of the temporal and secular powers. The other thing that's kind of happening is as a result of the barbarian conquest sort of consolidating power, you end up with a military class that is the days of the barbarian struggles in Europe have like with the Vikings were sort of the last hurrah maybe for the great barbarian raiders of Europe, and then all of a sudden you sort of got this potential powder keg of and almost like explosive potential for military capability that rises out of this thing called the knight class, which is then providentially, fortuitously, however you want to look at these things, channeled by this reformed papacy under Pope Urban II in 1099, which sets off what I think is kind of the defining feature of this era, the Crusades, which is, initially successful beyond many of the contemporaries' wildest expectations. So all of the princes of Europe, including the characters that we're going to be looking at, like Richard I, are compelled to go and fight. Now, whether they actually go and fight or not ends up being a different story for many of them, but they at least compelled to give lip service to the idea of crusading, which sort of takes hold and that gives way, like I said, to the age of knighthood and chivalric codes and all the romantic ideals around the period. And England is no different than pretty much what's happening on the continent. So could you, I know I just kind of rambled here a little bit, but could you kind of maybe speak to this idea of crusades and the spirit that arises out of it, especially per England?
Yeah, so you're right about what you said with regards to knighthood, the coming into being of these ideals of knighthood are basically, they're an effort to essentially Christianize warrior peoples. Because as you said, you had these barbarian tribes, and then, you had a very strongly warrior societies that are forming. And essentially the church is trying to put some guardrails on this and Christianize it. In a way, it's similar to the way that the church Christianizes things like, kingship in general. Kingship becomes a sacrament. There's ideals of kingship that become very specifically Christian. And it becomes almost like a sort of a form of a wedding vow or wedding sacrament between, the king and the land or the people. And of course, this has some precedent even in the pre-Christian world, this idea of a king marrying the land or the people. But within Christianity, there's a very particular idea that is put into place in the person of Christ, the ideas of the bride and the bridegroom, this mystical imagery that is used for, the church has kind of a mirror effect in how Christian kingship works out, in the way things are seen, in the way the king is seen as a steward of God, to
even in his anointing, that's a very Christ-like.
Absolutely. The entire act of anointing again was considered in the Middle Ages to be a sacrament because they didn't have a firm limitation on 7 sacraments back then, and it wasn't like that. They were still there wasn't that kind of thing that is now in place today when you think of the sacraments. So there was definitely an understanding of that. And the parallel here is with knighthood. Knighthood comes to be seen like something similar to that, like a sacrament. And the idea is that you have people who wield great power, whether they're a king or whether they're of this warrior class. And the idea is you're trying to purify that and put restraint on that so that it doesn't just become about might makes right. Essentially, you're trying to really put into practice the again Christian ideals of being a servant. These are the ideals of chivalry. That one who wields great power is wielding that power in order to defend, in order to protect, not simply out of mere aggression. Now, obviously, as with everything, making that become a reality when it comes to medieval feudal lords and kings is difficult. But that was an ideal. And I think that importance is there still. The idea that there was something to strive for, nevertheless. And that, you weren't supposed to just go ahead and do anything. There was supposed to be some type of thought that, hey, if you're a king, if you're a lord, if you are a knight, you have a responsibility to a higher power. You can't just do whatever you want, nor for merely your own glory or your own aggrandizement. It needs to, again, fall beneath these oaths that you've taken, these oaths before God, these ceremonies that you've engaged in. Again, like the anointing and the knighthood ceremonies, these things are very beautiful, really, when you read them, and all of the elements of, for example, items that would be used, the chain and spurs and the white cloth and all of these elements of knighthood that would be taken on. And every country in Christendom had their own traditions in this regard. And they all were supposed to be about remembering the different aspects of codes of chivalry and Christianity. That was deeply, deeply religious, elements
Can
to
I
every
can
act.
I can I add to it too before you continue on, just because it's very pertinent to what you're saying. With the story of William Aquitaine himself, I think it illustrates what you're getting at, because what many people forget to take into consideration with William is he himself was a knight of a certain caliber. Like, I mean, William had killed someone, and you can kind of read these men who society was calling upon to be violent on behalf of society. And the reality of the violence is, at a certain point, that sort of formation of a Christian conscience is it's like seeping into these men, and you can see it. So when William, it wasn't an accident that he founded a monastery. The idea was that that these people who are called upon to be violent, they realize the ethical conundrum of that. And so the idea was that as a noble, you would found a monastery on the land whereby these monks would continually pray for you on your behalf.
Battle
Because
Abbey. Battle
yes,
Abbey.
exactly. And so that's just kind of, I was just thinking of that just to give some kind of context to what you're discussing here with what's taking place with these men, who are, historically it would not have been a problem, but now they're like seriously giving consideration to the and I think society at that point was very aware. I think we're still in need. I mean, there's no way around it. Like, we are still in need of men to go do violent things on our behalf. But at least back then, they kind of also had the idea that this is a dangerous thing for the eternal soul of these people that we're asking to do this. And so these people would, in turn, found these monasteries where with William, if you read his charter, he's very explicit. And the reason that he's removing the monastery from being tied to the land was because he wanted these monks to pray for his soul in perpetuity beyond just his death. So
Absolutely. Yeah, no, everything you just said is absolutely true. It's fascinating to see, I guess, almost the gradual conversion of these peoples. It didn't all happen at once. And I mean, again, that's actually a big part of the series that I write as well, The Telling of the Beads. It is about kind of playing with the idea of how England is converted, but at the same time, there are undercurrents of that older paganism that are still under the surface and still drawing people, tugging people. They're not fully converted yet. There's a tension that's very real. And I think that's very, observable in the period. And I mean, touching back upon Thomas Becket too, it's interesting, of course, the idea when we're talking about kings and so forth being called to do penance for crimes. You think of Henry II, the aftermath of the, who will rid me of this meddlesome priest, sort of due south saga. You basically have, again, a situation where he is made to do penance for it, and that kind of thing you can see up and down the annals of Europe, where there is this sense that you have accountability, no matter if you're a king, no matter if you're a lord, no matter, and that was supposed to be a knight, and this is the thing, is that knighthood is a form of accountability, and true knighthood also has to have a balance where it's like the idea of the ideal was supposed to be that a man, his step is first in peaceful hall, his sword in battle keen. That's the ideal. The idea is that you're supposed to be able to wed gentility with, fierceness, if you will. There's like, and you have like a control. That's really what it is. And the idea within Christian world is, of course, this control is supposed to be because you're putting everything, you're putting yourself, you're putting whatever skills or strengths you have under the ideal of Christ. And this is why the church was hesitant for a very long time to canonize soldiers, because they didn't want it to become an ideal. They recognized that there was, as you say, a danger, very ever-present danger, making your life one of violence. And even though they lived in a very violent era, in a lot of ways, although I do think sometimes it's over. I will say this. Sometimes, especially in media, we have this thing that like, oh, violence, like this crazy violence was happening all the time, every day to everybody. And it's like, no, it wasn't quite like that. But still,
The English historian, is it? He said with England anyways that the violence in history just comes rushing in, but for the most part, English history is relatively stable. And
yeah, I would agree with that. I think that we have this notion, for example, yeah, we focus on things like the anarchy and stuff that happened at different points. And it's like, oh my, that's really bloody. And then we get this like Game of Thrones mentality that this was how it was all the time. But there was plenty of people who lived and died in their villages and never actually saw anybody get killed in there. You know what I mean? It's like, in other words, there was plenty of people in the medieval world who never actually did experience that kind of violence. There was other stuff that could happen to you, like in disease and things, but it wasn't like, oh, every day there's people that are getting hacked to pieces in front of. It wasn't quite like that. I think, again, we have a tendency because of media to think that's the way things were, but actually a lot of people lived relatively quiet and obscure lives, just going about, their day to day. It wasn't high drama all day every day. But still, at the same time, it is, of course, true that when there was violence, it was a violent, there was violence, that's for sure. And I think that in the case of, again, knights, the idea was that you knew you were taking your soul in your hands. And this is why, again, the church was hesitant to make soldiers the ideal. And that's why for a long time, they only really were canonizing people who in some way were not soldiers when they died, or were like, for example, Saint Sebastian, Saint George. Well, in one way or another, they kind of got pulled out of the military to be killed, in some way or other. So because they were saying, I am a Christian and I will not, in the case of George, I will not persecute my fellow Christians. Similarly with Sebastian and this kind of thing. So that was why they were becoming saints. Not, for example, in Islam, right? the major figures of Islam are almost all warriors. Now, not just, to be fair to this, not just warriors. I'm not trying to say they aren't like one-dimensional characters. There's like a lot of these warrior figures in Islamic tradition are actually pretty interesting for more reasons than the warrior aspect. They have like multiple different layers to their characters, and a lot of them might be called like warrior sages. And they have, again, they have more of a judicial role, and different, and then they have like again different elements of spiritual role, and they have a warrior role, and so there are multiple different aspects to them. But at the same time, it cannot be forgotten that all of them are still very outwardly have this warrior role, and generally speaking, in Islamic tradition, that is considered a good, that is considered. Whereas within Christianity, there is more of a sense of we're hesitant. We're very hesitant about that. We have more of a keen awareness. I think that really the simple fact is that Christ is not Muhammad. That's the simple reality of that. And so in that sense that Christ, and I mean, honestly, Muslims would agree to that. The way that Muslims would come at it typically from their point of view, they would say that Moses, brought the law and led the armies effectively into the promised land, and then Isa, Jesus, he's more the ascetic, spiritual, element, and then Muhammad brings them both together and fuses it. This is the Muslim point of view. But what I think for the Christian, one must say that Christ is the one that ultimately we're looking towards here, because we believe he's the Son of God. So he's the ultimate in terms of who we're following. And Christ was not a warrior. And Christ, of course, says he who lives by the sword will die by the sword. So there's a real tension within Christianity about, the idea of making your life as a warrior or something. It's tricky. You have to put a lot of safeguards up on it, because there's a real danger potentially of losing control of that, and in turn doing damage not only to yourself, but I think also doing damage to what Christ in a sense wants for the Christian people, for Christendom as a whole. And so all of this really, I guess, I think we went off. I think we were saying the Crusades. You want to you want to pull a question out of that or some comments? We'll rope our background.
Well, yeah, just I guess maybe to get us back on the trail. Let's kind of move over to Richard, the Coeur de Lion. I think he's something of an exemplar of medieval Europe. The great fighting king who goes and challenges Saladin face to face, in what I think is one of the great showdowns of history. But also there's some really maybe touching isn't the word. There's some admirable exchanges between Richard and Saladin and these two great warriors, not unlike maybe what you would find in, say, the respect that a Grant would have for a Lee or a Patton had for Rommel. There's the famous scene where Richard is ill, and you hear accounts of Saladin's disappointment, right? That this man that he admired is sort of like the end of the chance for him to. Obviously Saladin wanted to decisively defeat Richard, but you still get this, I think, a sense of like a unique, sort of like the manliness and honor that, yes, I will kill you, but you're a worthy adversary. And I find that endlessly fascinating in these two characters, sort of endlessly.
Absolutely. I don't think Saladin wanted particularly to kill him. I think he wanted to beat him. He wanted to beat his armies.
That's what I mean.
I don't think. Yeah, he had no particular desire for Richard personally to die. And he had I love Saladin. He had a very sarcastic sense of humor, very dry sense of humor. And so there was a number of instances in their very, like I said, they were very much enemy brothers. And this was the case. I always think of Wolfe and Montcalm with this. They're my other two favorite enemy brothers.
Quickly, would you just introduce Saladin for people that aren't familiar?
Sure. So Saladin is basically the anglicized. There's my word. Anglicized version of Salahuddin, which is the proper pronunciation of that. But yeah, so basically he was, the sultan, who'd basically risen to power after defeating various other, powers that be in the region. He was a Kurd himself, ends up rising to power, and the rise of the Ayyubi dynasty, and so forth under him. And basically he ends up controlling much of the Middle East. And if he's not in control of it directly, he at least is having tribute sent to him, sort of. So this is actually another thing that comes up in my series. A character shows up, Al-Kashif, who is a young basically aide de camp of Salahuddin. And he originally starts out being sent to Salahuddin as tribute from the city of Baghdad. So the idea would be that these various cities and everything would want to keep peace with him, so they would send their young men essentially to be like a symbol, right? Of, hey, we're giving you our, the sort of the cream of our crop to represent us to you, to keep our peace with you, and so forth. So the idea is that this young man, who his regular name is Ahmed bin Suleiman, but he gets the name Al-Kashif at a certain point in the story. Anyway, he's this young protege, essentially, with the sword, from a noble family in Baghdad. And so he is sent to Salahuddin, to be his bodyguard, basically. And he learns a lot from Salahuddin, not least about patience. Sabr is, in Arabic. And so there's this whole relationship with Salahuddin in the story as his mentor, and so forth. And the idea was that Salahuddin was an interesting character in that he was known for having a ferocious temper, but he controlled it a huge amount of the time, which Richard struggled to do. He had a ferocious temper as well, but he didn't control it nearly so well, which caused him some problems, especially when things happened. Like, oh gosh, there's an awesome story where essentially Richard, we love Richard. He is the most hands-on of guys. Doesn't matter that he's a king. He is willing to rough it up, put his body on the line at every opportunity, ride between the ranks, challenge anyone to hand-to-hand combat, fight in the midst of everything, go out to save his knights. He's beloved for being that way. He really did live up to this standard of knightly prowess. And there's this one instant where he knows he's going to be attacked by the Saracens. He's going to be charged. And so he and his, men are basically trying to build a barricade. They're going to be attacked. And essentially, he runs into some trouble, let's just say, with some of his French and his Austrian allies. Some really bad trouble. And they end up, as he's yelling at them to come help him, he gets mocked by them, for acting like a mere carpenter instead of a king. Not a good thing to say to Richard, because Richard then clonked one of them off a wall. So that kind of put a little bit of a damper on things for his alliance. Cobbering your allies, yeah, it's not really that great of a plan. So he had a little problem with temper, and so Salahuddin, his father had extreme temper to the point, like, there's a story that was saying he was threatening to literally kill his own son in the cradle when he was crying, when his father was under stress. So he had some temper issues. So Salahuddin wanted to be controlled because he said, I don't want to be kind of like that. I don't want to have that reputation. So he really, really worked hard on mastering his temper and his emotions. So he was very careful about what he let people see. And that's what made him a very effective, very interesting leader and character.
Yeah, and
And
he's well, just to kind of kind of put a bonnet on it. He's interesting too for the fact that up to this point, the Crusaders had been seen as a bit invincible, and Saladin was of the and what I know of Saladin is mainly through modern historian interpretation. So if you have anything to correct me on this, feel free to do so. But my understanding is that Saladin sort of saw a general feeling of pessimism among the Islamic world, where this is sort of our lot. The West was invincible. And it's not a one-to-one comparison, but it's almost like in the same sense that Osama bin Laden kind of smashed the invincibility of the West on September 11th. Saladin, through his successes in battle, kind of began to at least put a major dent in the invincibility, the sort of aura of the Western Knights as invincible. Is that fairly accurate?
well, I think it went up and down with regards to with regards to what they would call them was the Franks. So you know the Muslim chroniclers would typically just group them as the Franks, just like they were being grouped as the Saracens. Saracen is a catch-all word that is a mispronunciation of Syrian, and then just kind of became all you guys. So they were calling to the Franks and Saracens, and they actually came from all different places. But yeah, you basically had a situation where the Franks were at first seen as not a big threat, and then all of a sudden they did better, as you said, than everybody expected, and they took Jerusalem, and then all of a sudden they did become, rather a threat, although things wobbled back and forth quite a bit, depending on, like, what part of land was everyone fighting for, trying to get or trying to expand. It varied. So I wouldn't say they were, like, seen as invincible in general, but I would say that taking Jerusalem seemed out of reach for a lot of people in the Muslim world. And they were dreaming of getting back Al-Quds, Jerusalem, the holy city. And that I also kind of have, there's a sequence also with Al-Kashif when he's like 13 or so, and showing how, like, young men of this time in the Muslim world, or what are they thinking about when we're going to get Al-Quds back? So very similar to how that sort of fervor you end up with in the Christian world, the same kind of young men thinking about getting Jerusalem back. And, they both have, religious reasons motivating them to do that. And also, how religion and culture overlap. There's this, warrior energy of young men in general. So when you're being told that this is, a gallant goal to go for, it's going to inspire you. And so for the longest time, they're waiting for someone, right, in the Muslim world to come and help them get Al-Quds back. And so ultimately, of course, Saladin becomes kind of like the prince that was promised kind of vibes with this. And so he does indeed, by his ascent, at first through the Muslim world, because he had to knock down a lot of different kingpins in order to get to his role. But he was always saying at that point, well, I'm not just doing this for my family's dynasty. I mean, sure, dynastic goals are a part of things. I mean, but still, he was like, I'm doing it so that we can unite, all of Islam together in this jihad, and, get back Al-Quds, and get everyone together for this. So he did it. he did it. It was quite impressive under the circumstances, and it was a bit rather unexpected from, the Frankish perspective, that they didn't quite see. Well, I mean, it was interesting because, before there was the sort of Richard Saladin, enemy brothers bromance of sorts. There was the one between Saladin and Baldwin the Leper, which was pretty awesome in its own right. I mean, Baldwin was a fascinating character. He's a young man. He's in his 20s, and he's got this debilitating leprosy condition. And, Saladin could not take Jerusalem while Baldwin lived. And so Saladin respected him for that a ton. And you've got very marks of respect between them, because they were, as you say, they were both men of honor. Men of honor who were fighting for their respective sides with all the stamina they could possibly muster. And there was a sense that they knew each other quite well through their enemyship. And there was almost an intimacy to that. So that was the case with regards to Baldwin and Saladin. And then of course you get Richard who is coming back to try his goal being to retake Jerusalem, from Saladin. And they're kind of like the two greats of their age. It is one of these like rare moments in history where you get people so evenly matched that you just know it's going to be a great game. Like that kind of a situation. And just again, like you said, there's a lot of instances of respect between the two of them, a lot of gift giving and sharing between the two of them. And you have also a very fascinating character in Saladin, Saladin's brother, who also is a regular go-between between Saladin and Richard. And they have loads of tent parties essentially with each other during parlays. And Richard ends up knighting his son, Saladin's son, Saladin's nephew, who grows up to become the Sultan that meets Francis of Assisi. So that's a thing that happens too. So they've got this whole interesting frenemyship going on. And it was interesting. It makes you kind of sad in various ways. It always is with these relationships that, everybody couldn't have found a more productive way to deal with stuff going on. And, instead, united their powers towards something, but, being that as it is, though, still we got some pretty epic matches out of this. So there's one instance where Saladin actually tips off Richard when Richard is ill. He essentially says to him this, like, Richard, I know you've been sick, and I'm sorry about that. So listen, I'm going to have to attack you, but I thought I would give you a heads up so you can get yourself prepared, because I don't want to, take unfair advantage of how flat out you are. So, I want to give you a chance to get up, sort yourself out here for 15 minutes and stuff. But you have to promise me you're not going to run away, because I don't think you're going to run away, right? Because you're not going to do that. We got an understanding, right? You wouldn't run. And so Richard is like, just give me enough time to get out of bed and get my armor on. And he's like, that's my boy. And so this weird relationship. And like you said, you're correct about it. When he was sick, Saladin sent him pears and stuff that were frozen fruit and stuff that he knew would take down fever, because Saladin dealt with his own ill health for a lot of his life. He dealt with lots of different fevers. In fact, he eventually died from one. So he knew the kind of stuff that would take down fever and so forth. And so there was that. There was the incident of sending Richard horses. He sent him 2 horses when his horse, I believe, was shot. So they had a back and forth. Richard ended up sending Saladin sweaters, of all things. I would kind of laugh at this because there's this kind of wonky story about how Saladin, they're at a tent party, and this is a parlay, and it's getting toward the end of the war. They're doing like the wrap up, sort of, where they're doing that truce. They said, give me a truce. I got to go back home and figure things out and stuff. And Saladin says with great dry humor, like, oh, well, I just want you to know that I think so well of you that if I were, going to lose essentially my territory to anybody, I would want it to be you if I had resigned myself to losing my territory.
Yeah.
And so he basically is Saladin. They're at a tent party and whatnot, and there's essentially a dancing girl and singing dancing girl, etc. And Saladin's like, hey, you like her? You can have her here. And so Richard is like, oh yeah. And then Richard chaplain gets involved. He's like, whoa, no. And Richard is like, but that would be insulting for me not to take her home. You're not taking her anywhere, man. So this whole back and forth breaks out. I think Richard had to leave her behind. Poor Richard. But that was a thing that happened too. So yeah, they had a fun back and forth. The Ayubi Plantagenet dynasty, relationship was pretty awesome. And of course there was an incident where Richard actually tried to say, "Hey, why don't we intermarry?" And says half of it, what? I've got a sister, and she could marry you, and you and her can reproduce, and then your kids, they could have Jerusalem, and we solved the problem. And so Saladin and Saladin are both kind of like, yeah, we had no idea that your sister wanted to convert to Islam. And he's like, yeah, she doesn't at all. I was thinking of somebody going the other way. And it's like, yeah, that's happening. It's like, oh, and then and he's like, well, can't we just do it like half and half? And maybe some of they start going through this whole thing. And Saladin is sort of like, did you write your sister about this idea? And he's like, well, and I mean, by the time she finds out, she just flips the heck out, because it was a terrible idea. She did not want to be part of Saladin's harem at all. And so, but yeah, that was very much of a Richard on party high kind of idea.
Well, it's interesting to me, and this would maybe get too far afield, but just to kind of bring it up, when I was a child of the 9/11 world, and one of the things I used to find so like bizarre was when you would listen to like reports coming from out of the Middle East at that time, around the 2001, 2002, 3 period. You would always hear this like accusation of us as crusaders, right? The West was the crusaders. I was like, well, where is that coming? Like that I even knew enough then to know that was like a very far away world from what the West was doing today. But the interesting thing was that Bin Laden, through his Saudi education, was very much saw himself in a modern day Saladin role, where he was going to unite the the Muslim world rather, to retake the holy city. That was a major part of his like grand project. So then like when you put it into that context, it's like, gosh, I guess there is quite a few parallels there. Unfortunately,
if Bush was supposed to be Richard the Lionheart and Bin Laden was about like, please no, like, I mean, I think that's insulting to both of them. And I feel like it reminds me of the Kingdom of Heaven movie, where it was just like, this is actually the Iraq War. And it's like, no,
well, I will give, I mean, as far as a formidable opponent goes, I think Osama bin Laden was a formidable opponent. He was certainly no Saladin. By far, George Bush was no Richard the Lionheart. And what I was about to say is, we unfortunately had no equivalent to the great crusading knights of that era. So that's where it completely falls apart. But anyways, bin Laden saw himself as that, whether the reality.
Yeah, he self-identified.
Exactly. Now, just to shift a little bit here, but still with the period, we have two very popular legends that rise up, which I wanted to spend a little bit of time on. That of Arthur, Camelot, his knights, and then as well, maybe spend a little bit of time here as well on the Robin Hood legends. But starting with Arthur, I think the ultimate question with Arthur is, was he a real person? And why is the answer yes?
So I think yes, based on the primary sources we have from the annals of Wales, etc. However, yes, with a caveat. I mean, obviously, he's not the way that he's depicted in the medieval romances, but I do believe there was a Romano-British chieftain, essentially. Or figure, either a chieftain or a member of essentially the old Roman guard, if you will, who, ended up rising to kind of a local prominence in terms of trying to push back the Germanic tribes. at the time of their invasion. And that stuck in people's memory. And it would, of course, as well, because of the religious dynamic, which was that at the time, of course, the Anglo-Saxons are pagans and the Romano-Britons are Christian. So there's all of this, reference to Arthur bearing the shield of, that has the Virgin and the Christ child upon it and so forth. And so he's seen as very much of a Christian hero holding out for Christendom, which ironically is going to be the case later on when you get to like King Alfred. But he, of course, is a Saxon, but just because they end up converting. And then when he's dealing with the Norse invaders, etc. So I believe there was definitely an Arthur, but he was in a very particular time and place, in the Dark Ages, as it was called, even though I don't really like the term that much. But anyway, it is what it is. That he was in that place, and the stories that eventually grow up around him, come from various kings, including William the Conqueror, tying back around to him, sort of connecting or wanting to connect to this Arthurian sort of memory, if you will. And then that going on to spawn during the, Norman ascendancy in England. All kinds of romances. And of course, these things also really took off in France. So you get the French romances, French language romances, which make a little tie back to Richard the Lionheart. Also, like the French language romances about Richard the Lionheart proliferated. French, and then there was like French dialect, romances, different dialects from out of France, which really proliferated. And funnily enough, the last time I was on this program, I was talking about my current sort of trilogy project about the American Revolution, All Ye That Pass By, and the current one that's published, Gone for a Soldier. One of the main characters in that, the main historical characters who features, is General John Burgoyne, Gentleman Johnny. And he had a massive interest in Richard the Lionheart. And there was a lot of interesting comparisons between the two. Their bravado, their courage, they're putting their body on the line, riding about, the way that they could connect to their men in a very, kind of warm, passionate way, hands-on way. Like there's wonderful stories about like Richard the Lionheart spontaneously knighting people. So just like when he knighted Saladin's son, well, he would also, like, if a cook made a good meal that he liked, he would knight him. If a steward did a good job in battle and he saw it, he would knight him. Like, he was very a spontaneous, warm, passionate character, a warrior and an artist. And this ties into Johnny quite a bit, that he too is a warrior and an artist. And he gets inspired by these French language romances about Richard the Lionheart, and he adapts them into a play. So all kinds of interesting stuff right there. That kind of ties together my two series nicely, so I'm glad about that. but all of this to get back to Arthur, that Arthur was used by various figures in the the English monarchy now, that are of Norman extract, and they begin to really lean into him, and this proliferation of these romances begin to develop, and you get the various characters we're used to in the wider legends that begin to be added. The whole Arthur, Lancelot, Guinevere triangle begins to come about. You get the presence of all of these various knights figures, Gawain and Gareth, and Galahad and so forth. So that you get all of that begins to gradually come about, and it starts to be both an ideal that is being presented, the chivalric ideal, in a mythic past for Britain, which ends up incorporating a lot of different elements of myth that go way back. Because you can see, like, for example, in a lot of Welsh and Celtic lore, elements in other stories that eventually you see popping up in Arthurian lore. So it's like there's elements of Welsh mythology that are being preserved in these tales, and there's that interesting combination of really the Christian and the pagan, within the Arthurian stories, with Merlin sort of fitting the role of like a druid or something in a Christianized court, because this was actually a historical thing that was interesting. Then in
Yeah,
various
I
cases,
always tell people don't ask how Merlin was conceived if you don't already know.
oh yeah, let's hear Pendragon. Um, so yeah, no, I just, you know what? I just made a big error. No, not Arthur Pendragon. That was, yeah, no. That was actually something completely different. There, I've just rearranged that one right there. But no, yeah, Merlin's conception is a whole, yeah, that's a whole other thing. So
Yeah, and
I just got to see.
I'm pretty sure that's going to be born of some kind of like hint of a pagan mythical legend
Oh,
that sort of.
absolutely. Both of them. In the case of Uther Pendragon, this is Arthur's conception. I just confused Arthur and Merlin's conception, and that. but but yes, no, Merlin has a whole other thing going, and you get to see this with regards to, again, just the elements of pagan mythology that are preserved within these Arthurian cycles. And you get to see, though, elements also of little historical things. So, for example, the idea of when these courts and kings started to Christianize, right? In the Dark Ages in various locations. Well, they wouldn't just throw out necessarily the druid that was there, especially if the druid had been involved in raising the king. So you'd essentially find a way to do right by him. You'd keep him around, kind of. Even if your court had sort of Christianized, oftentimes this would happen, where a Christian king would still kind of have the person who raised him with him, because you're not going to just throw him out completely. So you have this liminal thing, and that's what some people think maybe a Merlin comes out of. But yeah, you do have this very interesting combination of elements with regards to Arthur, but it ultimately becomes both a symbol of this ideal of chivalry, Camelot, the kind of idyllic, in a way, society of what once was but could be, that kind of thing.
Mhm.
And the once and future, very much the once and future king, but the once and future kingdom. Um, and then, of course, you have the fact that it all comes tumbling down through sin, which is sort of, I think, the key to the Arthur stories. I think really what it is, it's a glimpse of paradise in some way. It's a glimpse of the resurrected world, but also not. It's not perfect. It almost reminds me a little bit about how, like, they'll say this about Lord of the Rings, how Frodo is like a glimpse of Christ at times, but not actually Christ.
Mhm.
That's what it feels like here with Arthur and Camelot. It's a glimpse in some way of Christ and the resurrection, but it's not ultimately completely, because it falls. The round table breaks. The fellowship is broken. The knights slay each other at Camlin. And that's why I try to use that as also a thematic element within the Revolutionary War story, because it deals with the breaking of empires. And so there's this, emphasis of that within that tale, of Camlin, of civil war.
Can I ask you,
And
Avellina, can as far as this particular thing, with the once and future king and its relation to the Christian narrative, one of the most famous myths around this time is this idea of the return of the king, so vital to Tolkien later, which
Mhm.
has its origins in the Arthurian legends. Do you know much around this particular legend as far as how it relates to what you're talking about?
Well, I definitely think that it has, it both has elements that exist in the pre-Christian world and pre-Christian myth. The idea of, I think it's probably, something fundamental to human beings. The idea of a king or a hero or a great figure who in some way is laid low and yet returns. I'm thinking of the story of Bran the Blessed
Mhm.
in Welsh mythology, that they cut off his head, but his head comes back to life. The idea of the cauldron of rebirth in Welsh stories, where you're essentially rendered as nothing, and then you your revived soldiers cast into the cauldron. So, because the Celts, and not just the Celts, many of these, Norse and the Germanic Anglo-Saxons as well shared in this, is this very strong belief in an afterlife. And obviously it varied from point to point as to exactly what the nature of it would be, but there was this sense of afterlife that was extremely, extremely strong for them. And so there was a sense, in a way, that like nothing is actually forever lost. Everything is just circles of circles and layers of the veils and things of this nature. And I think that the idea, though, with the Christianization of Europe and these myths, there is this sense of the once and future king having a very Christological sense, both in terms of the death and resurrection of Christ, but also in the sense of the second coming.
Mhm.
So there is this real idea that Arthur not only fulfills these ancient mythic longings and desires of things that we have lost returning to us, and archetypes, because it kind of goes back to the whole notion of kingship, And in the pagan world, you did have this understanding of the king marrying the land, and that was what made the land flourish. And you see that coming up even in like Jacobite lore. The idea of the king across the water, the songs and stories of that period have a very mythic feel. The idea of the king, will come back again? Bonnie Prince Charlie. These longings that do have a very particular foreshadowing of sorts of the ultimate longing, of the ultimate fulfillment, which again Christians believe comes at the consummation of the time-space continuum in Christ. So I think that is fundamentally something that Arthur keeps calling towards in the story, because it's almost like Arthur is a type of Christ who's foreshadowing things to come, yet cannot fully fulfill the type. And because the whole idea of it is because of sin. Sin is what brings down the round table, the fellowship, and everything. It's lost Eden. It's lost Eden, but it's also like the lost Eden that foreshadows yet the victory to come. So that, I think, is something that makes the Arthurian cycles endlessly fascinating, and it's something that is so lost in. I was so frustrated by the film The Green Knight, the A24 film. Annoyed me to no end, because they did not get that right. They didn't even do it right by a pagan point of view. We've gotten to the point where pagans are actually a dream compared to where we are at right now, in terms of the nihilistic, atheistic secularism. You cannot have myth unless you have belief in something beyond what you can merely see with your eyes. Effectively, you can't have myth with utter materialism. So you can have great stories from pagan tradition, from Christian tradition, from Islamic tradition, Jewish tradition, etc., 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 but you can't have it with atheist, because atheist tradition doesn't exist. You can't have truly proper tradition unless there is something that is moving you forward in some way, I suppose, towards something beyond one's immediate self. And the idea of just, frankly, the sort of dissolution of all things, which don't mean anything anyway, based upon that very dissolution.
Well, one thing I wanted to mention, and this is maybe not as lofty a part of, thoughts around the return of the king and the sort of grander narratives of things like this. And I don't know how deeply you want to get into this, but I think it's worth bringing up, if nothing else, to kind of shed some light on some of the absurdity of the medieval people. I absolutely love the medieval people. I've dedicated a huge portion of my channel to helping people reevaluate the medievals, but there is a certain absurdity to them, some an endearing absurdity nonetheless. But we have this idea of the age of romance and courtly love and the whole development around all of that. But there is, despite the tendency sometimes to water these histories down, especially those of us here today living on the other side of the, say the Victorian era,
Mhm.
to kind of push away some of the darker elements to those stories, because a huge part of those legends is the unfaithfulness of the women. And Arthur himself, in some of these tales, like being the victim of Guinevere's forays into adultery. And
Mhm.
now I'm by no means an expert in courtly love poems, but this is a fairly common motif, if I'm not mistaken, in the
Well, because
knightly tales.
Courtly love became kind of dumb. I'll be honest. Courtly love. Well, you know what? To be simply put, it turned a bit into paperbacks.
That's
That's
exactly what
basically
I was
what
going to ask. I
medieval.
was going to ask you,
Yeah.
is this the equivalent of like a medieval pulp novellas, right? It's like, is that what we're
So,
looking at?
so let's put it this way. It could be. When handled well, it was a commentary on sin. When handled poorly, it was basically pulp fiction. And then when handled just, I don't know, like let's face it, there was elements of just kind of old fashioned chauvinism in there where it's like, don't trust the women. They'll get you. And so there was that too going on. So a little bit of all of that, a little bit of all of that. Some fantasizing, some actual profound commentary, and some dudes afraid of chicks. Insecure, insecure. Some insecure guys are just like, oh, she's probably cheating on you with the page over there. And so
It was kind of amazing how often that theme plays up, and I'm like, goodness, you guys, man, this is not a good look. I'm like, to be that
and I
to
guess
be that like, I mean, it's if and I think it's a common enough theme that it must have been something in the psyche, or just like you said, like I mean, quote unquote, sold well. I'm not quite for sure what's happening there.
well, like I know that there was some very goofy theories that medieval men had at times about women. So for example, there was a tradition of don't let your women eat spice.
Hmm.
Spice will make them cheat on you. Spice will do things. So there's a lot, like there was a lot of that, and you had the same thing in the Middle East, like with Islamic men being
Hmm.
this just as wacky as Christian men, and then you're just kind of like, don't let them out. They'll do crazy things. And sometimes I am just kind of like, you guys had a pretty like okay, so for example, nobles in the Middle Ages, I mean, these guys had mistresses galore a lot of the times, and then you got in the Islamic world, you guys got like harems. I'm just sort of like, it's like sort of a look in the mirror kind of thing here, and maybe sort
Yeah,
out your own. Too
when you
much
like
spice, guys. Too much spice.
when you like realize the reality that most of the medieval like major cities, they would have kept, like brothels, and they relegated them to a certain parts of the city, but nonetheless the reality of them was there. You even have theologians of the time sort of making kind of justifications for it. So yeah, I mean, sometimes the double standard there is, especially like in hindsight, looking back at them, it's a bit stark. I know sometimes like we can look back on, there's errors that we make in modernity that I'm sure people are going to be, that I know people will be looking back wondering what what
Oh
what the
yeah.
heck was wrong with us. But maybe another more significant theme than the theme of infidelity, going back to the sort of crusading aspects of all of this
Mhm.
conversation, and this could maybe help us segue into some of the stories of Robin Hood. But for the Arthurian stories, my understanding is that they begin to really, and you were kind of hinting at this, but they begin to really take on a crusading ethos.
Mhm.
Famously around the Holy Grail. And I guess this is just taking that old motifs and the old legends and just putting them into a context that the people of this period really would have spoken to them.
Well, there are some very interesting. You bring up the Holy Grail. It's funny because I'm writing a Holy Grail section right now for the
Hmm.
Revolutionary War book. I know it's so funny. I end up writing some of the medieval stuff for the 18th century book that you would more or less expect to show up in the actual medieval book. But there's happening, things are happening. But anyway, so with the Holy Grail, it is essentially, in a lot of, if you read some of the text of medieval, like Arthurian romances and stuff, you can see like almost a direct parallel between things said of the Grail and things said of the Cauldron in Welsh and other interconnected Celtic mythologies. Very similar idea of a certain, you know, a certain item that contains liquid of some kind and enables the sort of flourishing of the realm and brings new life to things, saves the kingdom. And so you have the idea, the image in both cases of like almost a womb, a womb, a rebirth is brought through that womb. And so this was for pagans, it had a lot to do with the life cycle, life, death, and rebirth. For Christians, though, too, there's the element of the death and resurrection. And of course, very specifically tied to Christ, very specifically tied to the Last Supper, very specifically tied to the Eucharist. So there is this whole idea of the birth of blood, the idea of this, the idea of the source and summit, really, of the Christian life and sacramental identity that comes into play with regards to the Grail. And it ties in wonderfully to the other legends involving Joseph of Arimathea
Hmm.
visiting England. And some versions of that even have that the Christ child visited England. So you have like wonderful stories and elements there and different. I think for me, like these things are so wonderful also because you can see I think the Christian elements bringing out wisdom from the pagan elements too. It's like they actually marry in a very, very interesting and unique way that beautifully preserves this culture that was truly seeking um a depth of understanding, I think, of the human condition, and seeking a way to redeem the human condition in different ways, whether that condition was death even in and of itself. The pagans was still thinking about, well, what happens after death? How can death be turned on its head? They were seeking eucatastrophe, you might say, the Tolkien word for that. And that's something that you run into, with the Grail, with the images of the Grail. And yes, the idea of swinging into the Crusades, the idea of the Arthurian knights and their goals, their lofty goals, their pilgrimage, right? The idea of pilgrimage was so much a part of that medieval culture, the idea that the war itself was a pilgrimage. And I mean, interestingly enough, that was basically the way the Muslims saw things too, when it came to the Crusades. It was very interesting because you have got, I think one of the reasons why it is interesting to me particularly is because you do have armies of people who they're both, motivated by trying to live up to something higher than themselves. They're both going towards something which is a religious goal. That they both believe something holy happened in this place, and then they're willing to lay down their lives and fortunes and everything else in order to try to make that pilgrimage effectively. And so there's a certain honor to that. This, just in terms of, yeah, I mean, for the Christian, quite obviously, it's the focal point of the death and resurrection of Christ. It's the fundamental, reality of the Christian story, the historicity of the Christian story, and the fundamental pilgrimage locations as a result. For Islam, it's the night journey of Muhammad. So the whole very interesting story as well. Like there's whole layers upon layers in terms of Islamic storytelling traditions that come out of this. So, in terms of all of the different layers that we're supposed to have unfolded in terms of Muhammad's journey through the different layers of paradise, essentially on the Barak, the winged horse, and there's like every single layer has like a 20 different meanings to it and involved in each layer, and so it's just very interesting again how you get these people who are like motivated towards the Jerusalem or Quds, the city, and the city represents something that is ineffable to them. It represents something that it cannot be held within an actual place, if you will, and yet it is. It's fascinating. It's both, I guess, the physical and the spiritual overlapping in this particular way, which is motivating these people towards the city. And so I guess the point simply being that the Arthurian cycles speak to that in terms of that hunt for the Holy Grail. And it certainly was something that Christian knights could take a connection to and an inspiration from this pilgrimage. Although, and I mean, ironically, interestingly enough, when you think about it, the Christian knights ultimately could not hold Jerusalem, just like they couldn't really take the Holy Grail back. There was something that didn't, it was something that wasn't, you couldn't physically grasp it, and you couldn't quite hold it. So that was an interesting parallel as well. And lastly, when we were talking about, it just had a thought with regards to courtly love and the poetry of the period that comes about with romance and so forth. One of the interesting things is that some of that actually comes from contact with the East. So knights from the West go east, and they, just to be clear, I mean, these peoples already had their own poetry going. I mean, Anglo-Saxon poetry is some of my favorite poetry in terms of historical poetry. It's just awesome. But at the same time, you do notice a shift through Islamic influence on poetry styles. So a lot of Sufi poetry, for example, is mystical love poetry. And then what ended up happening was it kind of got borrowed by, well, it got two ways it went in the West. One, the better way, by far, in my opinion, was that it ended up being used by actual Christian mystics, like, for example, St. John of the Cross. You can see elements of contact with the Moors, quite frankly, in Spain. Just made it that certain poetic styles and phrases you can see being used by John that were also used by various Sufi poets. And you can see that this was something that had proliferated within society at that point in the West through that contact, both from the Moorish conquests, but also from contact back in the Crusades. But you also then get the secondary form of this kind of riffing, which is a little less great. And it's this sort of courtly love kind of thing. So they're taking things the Sufis would normally have used to talk about God, and they're using it to talk about Suzette down at the baguette shop. You get the point. It sort of devolves a bit. So I mean, not that it, like, again, some people would say, okay, but you could make this argument that they then started to see something in human love which mirrored the divine. So we can give them a positive on that, perhaps, where there was this sense of human love actually having a mirror to divine love in a way that up to that point hadn't quite been expressed in the same manner in the West. So that was another takeaway from the Crusades.
All right, so we are at almost an hour and 30 minutes, and I want to now have you introduce us. You have written about him. I think this is a subject that is probably near and dear to you. So if you would, tell us about Robin Hood. Are we talking about a nobleman? Or are we talking about a knight, a yeoman? Will the real Robin Hood legend please stand up?
So Robin Hood, can be all of the above, because at all different points in Legendarium, he has manifested as those things. I think that that's the beautiful part of a legend that spans so many centuries, is that ultimately he comes to represent various things for various people with certain consistence holding throughout. In the very earliest versions of the story, he's actually set in, well, at least let me actually clarify that. The very earliest written versions of the story.
Mhm.
So quite possibly this was something that was orally in existence well before it was written, or at least various aspects of it definitely were in existence prior to it being written. But the earliest version is in the reign of Edward Longshanks, Edward the First, and Robin is depicted as a yeoman. However, again, in the retellings as they come, Robin shifts all over different reigns. He becomes very much of a liminal character, which is kind of what he is. See, the thing is that there's been a lot of speculation that Robin Hood is kind of a catch-all term. He represents very much of a kind of green man of the woods kind of thing. He's a kind of a mischief maker. He's an outlaw, trickster, a little bit of Reynard the Fox in there, a little bit of, again, sort of the green man figures, the horned god figures from out of Celtic myth, a little bit of just a variety of outlaw kind of ballads and stories that get thrown about. So he's a little bit of all of those things. He's a little bit of the Saxon and Welsh rebels in the aftermath of the Norman conquest, figures like Hereward the Wake. He's a little bit of various real outlawed figures. So, for example, you have certain claimants who, were outlawed nobles in the aftermath of Simon de Montfort's rebellion, the Barons Rising, and all of that. You've got so many different areas of English history and wider British Isles history that kind of feed into the growing mythos of Robin Hood. But the things that always stay are the fact that he is in some way on the wrong side of the law, that he has this trickster way. He's the merry jest, if you will. He has a certain comic flair on the one hand, and the other thing is that fundamentally he is there to turn things topsy turvy. Essentially, he thumbs his nose, if you will, at those in places of power, and he'll help those down on their luck. And I know some people who will say, oh, the later Robin Hood helping the poor isn't in the oldest ballads. That's actually not true. One of the oldest ballads that we have is of Robin Hood and the Beggar Knight. And it all involves Robin almost robbing a knight until he finds out the man is broke. And then he is like, hey, do you want a loan? So if that is one of the earliest, I'm like, no, that's always been there. Now it's been emphasized to greater or lesser extents in different versions, but that has always been there. Robin is meant to be a figure who is challenging to the expectation. In the earliest myths, he's also someone who's a devout Catholic. He has a deep devotion to the Blessed Virgin Mary. He prays his rosary. He risks capture to attend mass on Lady Days. It's a fundamental aspect of his character, and he refuses to harm women. That's been consistent in him. He's a outlaw with an honor code, and that through the ages, again, he comes to represent different things for different people. And you have eventually that he comes to be kind of firmly planted in the imagination with the reign of Richard the Lionheart. Interestingly, he really becomes firmly planted there through a Scottish author, Sir Walter Scott, in Ivanhoe. As I said, he shifted around to different reigns. I mean, you can find poetry and ballads and so forth dealing with Robin, ranging all the way to the reign of Henry V. It was almost like whoever was writing it at whatever time would just stick Robin in that reign. that they were in, and would play with it that way. And so it was very much of a fluid thing. But Walter Scott with his magic, manages to really use his storytelling skills to cement him having a crossover with that reign of the Lionheart. And I think the reason why that one stuck so much is because it really does go into this, like, the age of romance that already is laid down because of Richard's legend is already established. So I think Robin Hood just went into that even more, and the idea of Richard, the great crusading king, returning again, this notion of the return of the king, returning to England and meeting the Prince of Thieves, and there's just something so richly romantic about that, and that they ultimately have this understanding with one another. It's something that is very, I think, there's something very telling, I think, also about Englishness, English character, English rebel streak. That on the one hand they have this rebel streak, but on the other hand there's something also that is tethered to a certain tradition, that balances off with the meeting of the king and the outlaw.
So related to all of this, and I know you'll have a great answer for it. It's just a matter of me asking the question correctly. So let me see if I can phrase this question right. Let me see if I can set the stage for you. So you have this, you said this sort of thread, sort of a rebellious, anti-authoritarian nature, even to the early Robin Hood stories. My understanding, there's even a little bit of a certain sort of anti-clericalism thrown in there. His disdain for the infamous Sheriff of Nottingham, I think, goes back pretty far. At the same time, we as moderns are living in a, post-materialist Marxist paradigm. And I wonder how much of the history is salvageable. Like, if we were to try to remove that lens and try to look at Robin Hood, pre-materialist theories, pre-capitalist theories, does Robin Hood still retain that sort of proletariat revolutionary for the masses, kind of me against the oppressors? He really seems to. Now, like I said, in some ways I think this is, like, myself and others today that look back on Robin Hood, I think we're looking at him through that prism. I guess my question kind of is, does that prism exist before, like, Marx, for example? Is that how a 15th, 16th century reader or listener of the Robin Hood story would have been seeing him?
Well, you see, I don't think it would be quite correct to call Robin a revolutionary, certainly not in the traditional stories. But he is a rebel in his own way. He's a rebel against various people in positions of power, and also structures that have been corrupted. It's almost as if he, in his position as outlaw, is there to be a burr under their saddle. He's that's what it's supposed to be. And there's some really good stories though that indicate Robin is attempting to actually teach them a lesson, and there's like some hope of that maybe they'll learn something out of this. So that's the thing. He's sort of there to teach them in a way that nobody else can. There's a wonderful, actually, early story where it's like, you have that he has this back and forth with the Sheriff of Nottingham, but the sheriff is not always depicted as purely evil. The sheriff is, he's the sheriff. He may not be the greatest guy in the world, but he's not necessarily evil. One story version has it that Robin, or should I say Little John, ended up stealing some of his plates, the sheriff's, like, gilt plates. And then at a certain point, the sheriff ends up captured at Robin's camp and all the hijinks that goes on with that. But Robin ends up returning the plates, saying essentially, you are not all that bad to your people. Actually, you may enable other people to be bad to their people, but you are not actually. So you may take the plates back, courtesy of the host. And there's that kind of thing. There's something similar, I mean, a little different, but when as you say, he's very against corrupt clerics. But there's the story that he waylays some, corrupt abbot or whatnot, and he robs the abbot, but he won't touch the candlesticks. He's like, those are for the church. They go to the church. He has this code that he holds to, and he makes the distinction, I think, between the actual person who's failing he's shaming them. He's shaming them by having a higher code than they do, even though they're supposed to be the ones representing the law, the church, what have you. They're the ones supposed to be doing that. And he's going to teach them a lesson, and he's in this particular role in which to do it. And that, I think, is something distinct from these sort of modern notions of marks. I think when we try to make Robin into some sort of revolutionary of that type, we're doing violence to the story, actually, and the role that it played in people's consciousness and stuff. I think that is sort of twisting it out of shape and turning it into something, again, modern, which it's not. And I think that, yeah, fundamentally Robin is someone who is yet under authority, even as he is striking back at what he sees as corruption and authority, as this outlaw figure who, again, at the end of the day, is being an outlaw. That's within the stories. But at the same time, he recognizes the higher authority of God. He recognizes this devotion to the Blessed Virgin Mary is particularly touching, and gears him into kind of like a code of chivalry. He's a knight without being a knight. That's, I think, the point with Robin. That's the irony. He's acting like a knight. I think that and medievals fully understood that. These things that Robin does, whether it's going into mass on Lady Days, whether it's praying, telling his beads, whether it is not touching the candlesticks, whether it's like harm ye no woman, nor man in woman's company. These are things that knights would be trying to live up to. These are knightly codes. And he's an outlaw living in the forest. Why he has these knightly codes. That's why having him cross paths, I think, with Richard the Lionheart, what was something that came about. And it's not that either Robin or Richard are perfect, because they're not. But it's the idea that there's this striving towards these codes of knighthood that make them both of the same ethos, if you will.
Yeah, I think Robin Hood is probably the first experience that many of us have in the, at least in the English-speaking world, where for when as a young child, the world's always very black and white, right and wrong, and children actually do have a wonderful sense of justice. But I think Robin Hood is probably that first instance where the as an outlaw, the concept of being an outlaw. The thing that Robin challenges and maybe kind of gets the gears turning, especially for young minds, is that laws, especially those of us with this English background, with English common law and the development of all of that, presuppose a certain justice being rendered. And when that justice becomes corrupt, you find yourself an outlaw. So I think there's a wonderful motif to that. And I also think too, I think one of the things that you said in there, which would purely dispel it being any kind of, pre-Marxist rendition. Now, this isn't to say, I think it's maybe fair to say that a certain element of Robin Hood tapped into maybe some class frustrations
Yes,
without
I would agree.
necessarily presupposing all of the baggage that comes along with Marxism beyond that. I think maybe that's it.
Well, I
But
think, yeah.
well, and just quickly, I think the thing that you were going to say that maybe like would dispel any reading of Robin Hood as a Marxist revolutionary before there was a term for such is his um, that ethical code that he's working with is he's not trying to overthrow the established order.
No.
He's trying to correct it or restore it rather to its principles that it's supposed to be living by, maybe, which would undermine Marxism, which is, that is supposed to be actually a revolutionary in the truest sense of the word, revolutionary overthrow of the old order. So that was just the thought I was having.
Exactly. No, I agree. And I think that the key in my story, at least, and again, so Robin has gone through many different variations, and within the stories and the different versions of the stories that are told down through the centuries, there are different indications. So even though, the earliest ones seem to be referring to him as a yeoman, in other stories, they're inferring he's more than that. They're inferring that they're inferring that he's a gentleman well met. Now again, that could be a prosperous yeoman, a high ranking. Because when we think of yeoman, I think sometimes we think of same thing with the word peasant. Peasant did not always mean poor. It's like a misnomer. Peasant means one who works the earth. You could be a prosperous peasant and actually own your own land, own your own house. It wasn't people nowadays. It sort of I've run into this actually sometimes when even in the 18th century book, people would refer to whole groups of people as peasants, and they immediately think, oh, they're insulting them. And it's like, well, no, not necessarily. They're just actually designating these people are farmers. That's what that's the term that they would use, the peasants of the vicinity. It means the farmers, the farming people of the vicinity. It doesn't matter how much money they're deriving from the project. The point simply is they are, they're of a common class and they farm. But you could actually be quite a prosperous peasant. So this is the point with regards to Robin. Some of these could mean that, like that they're a relatively well-off yeoman, or it could mean something else. It could mean that he is an exiled person from a higher class, which was very much of a real thing. I mean, nobles got outlawed. I mean, it is a reality. Nobles and gentry, they did run afoul of the king or the court or the authorities in various ways, or fell into debt, and they ended up outlawed. So basically the point is Robin can be of any number of classes. Within the stories, it varies as to which one it seems that he is at given points. In my particular story, I have him be from one of the last Saxon noble houses in actually the last Saxon noble house in Nottinghamshire, one of the last of the wider vicinity, to hold land. So he is a noble, but as the story progresses, not to give away too much, but he finds himself more in a yeoman position. So in other words, one could lose that status and find themselves in a yeoman position, no longer being acknowledged by essentially the law as being noble. And so that's the way I kind of square that circle in my story. But it is very much, I mean, within that story and within my American Revolution story, where we have the character Ned Southworth, both Robin and Ned, my protagonists for each project, are basically down in their luck nobles who have an understanding of nobility as a responsibility. That's, I think, the key. So nobility at its best really is supposed to be connected to noblesse oblige. It's supposed to be connected to, okay, so, in the feudal era, for example, the situation was supposed to be people bind themselves to you, but for things that are supposed to be given back to them. It's not a one-way street. So it's supposed to be that a lord, this is another element where Christianity is supposed to play a role in this, and Robin's father, Elfrich, is important in this as well in terms of how he views his role as a lord. He's very devout Christian, and so he views it very much as a responsibility. So yes, the bondsmen, yeah, they have the responsibility of tilling the fields, but the Lord has the responsibility of making sure that his bondsmen are well taken care of. He has to make sure that they are reasonably fed, housed, and protected from harm. That is the prerogative of the Lord. And then, that's supposed to be the arrangement. Sadly, of course, lots of people just abuse the privilege, and that becomes an abuse of power, not so much something against power at all, or an effort to level everything. So I guess there's a fine line, and I think this is even true of like the modern era in which we can talk about these things, that an attempt to artificially level everything just results in horrific tyranny. It's like it always has. Always artificial leveling of everything just results in disaster, because there's honestly something natural and organic to there being hierarchy. It's that way in nature. It's that way in everything. Now, there is truth to the idea of trying to, like, being a good thing to lessen perhaps the extremity of gaps. Like, I agree with that. Like the
Mhm.
sheer, gaps between rich and poor and so forth. But at the same time, I think our notion that we can create our own utopia if we just flatten everything is nonsense, and it just ends up eating itself alive at the end of the day. So in fact, I mean, I would actually argue that there's a certain ideal, I think, in hierarchy, in the idea of kingship and nobility and the paternalism that was part of the ideal of that was a better ideal. Not always that it was lived out well, but it was a better ideal than I think what we see today in modern republics and what we see today in a lot of materialist consumerist culture, and that kind of thing. I think that actually the older ideal was better, but people didn't live up to it well, because that's the way of things.
Mhm.
So in other words, even though I'm happy to admit the flaws in the extremities, for example, of class system, I still think that when you try and just demonize the class system stupidly, and you kind of try again to sort of flatten everything out, you genuinely do create worse sinkholes for yourself and everybody else in a society. And that's something that I try to show within like my retelling of the Robin Hood mythos and my telling of the American Revolution story, that they are stories, I think, actually about what is noblesse oblige. Maybe that is like the
Mhm.
core of them. What is the obligation of the noble? What is the responsibility of having been born to power, or whatnot? What actually is it? For Christians too. What does that mean? And what does that mean? Because I mean, fundamentally, for the Christian, is the idea of the dignity of the human person, because all human beings are created in the image and likeness of God, and they've all been, Christ died for all men. So what does this mean? And that is something that again I explore through both series.
Well, we discussed at length last time the Revolutionary War series, and while this conversation has been kind of saturated with the subject and your involvement in it, could you just remind everybody once again this retelling work of Robin Hood that you're speaking of?
Sure, sure,
The one that
Robin
you
Hood.
wrote, Robin Hood, yes.
Sure. Okay, got it. So, the telling of the beads is the name of the series. It's a reference to the rosary element that is in the earliest Robin Hood traditions, and it effectively is striving to tell the story of Robin, and his arise as this legendary outlaw folk hero, and his fall, how he's ultimately um, taken down as an outlaw. And so that's like the basic premise of it, sort of the rise and fall of his outlaw career. And yeah, there's multiple perspectives in it. So the first book is published, Saplings of Sherwood. I'm working on the second book, which is Small Apples Grow. And in the first book, it basically covered Robin from the time when he was a small child. He's like 5 years old when we open the story, to when he's in his teens. He's like 16 when the story ends. And we're opening in book 2 when he's 16, and it's going to run until he is outlawed at age 20. So it's very much, it's an origin story that deals with, how he again becomes this figure that is so important in terms of giving hope to so many people. And the pitfalls of that, though, for Robin, in terms of the risks to his own soul, kind of what we were talking about, of living a life of violence, and trying to be careful not to lose himself to the wild, if you will. So it is very much of a tension between his Christian and his sort of pagan elements. And we also have, from perspectives, we have Marion is also a perspective character, who is a Norman, whereas Robin is of Saxon origin. She's of Norman ancestry and is a neighbor to Robin. And they grow up together and slowly, fall in love. But there's a lot of tension about the two families coming from these different backgrounds, and the difficulties of them being together. And then the third perspective is a very important one, because it's Robin's future nemesis, basically. And we meet him as the other neighbor of the Locksley family, Roger Cavendish, also from the largest land-holding Norman family in the Shire. And Roger has his own issues, though. He's about a dozen years older than Robin. And he has always struggled in his life with ill health. So even though he comes from this position of power compared to the Locksleys, he struggles with ill health, with what would now be considered severe asthma. And he is berated oftentimes, for it, considered to be a milksop. He comes from quite an abusive household as well. His parents are very dysfunctional. And so he struggles a lot in his life to try and, find equal footing in a lot of ways, and kind of regain some self-worth. And he does, for a little while, manage to start to stabilize through this arranged marriage to Rosalinda, who, actually starts to help him a little bit, find himself in a good way. And then tragedy strikes. So that tragedy sadly sends him down a dark path, and we kind of follow that, and how that will ultimately intertwine with Robin and Marion's stories as the series goes on. And as I mentioned, we're going to have other characters start to play a role as well. One of them is going to be Celia, Roger and Rosalinda's daughter, who becomes a major character in later books. And in fact, she's the one telling the story, we find out in the end. She's the one chronicling. And then we also meet Al-Kashif Ahmed bin Suleiman, who was Saladin's basically bodyguard, who has been captured. Is based on a real story. One of Saladin's aides was indeed captured by distracting knights who were coming to capture Saladin, and he basically tells him, "Run! I will, ride the other way and fight them." And this all happened. Historically, we think that guy probably died. Probably got ganged up on and died. However, in our version, he doesn't die. He is captured and he's taken to England as a prisoner of war, but then he's allowed various privileges if he will essentially become a mercenary for his captor, Rand Tyndall, who also becomes a major character who has his own agenda, his own very particular agenda to gain control within the Shire, which is of a strategic location, and he has his own plans in mind. He's very much of a self-serving character, we find out. So there's all different. It's a pretty long story. There's all different kinds of characters. We follow another character, Sir Thomas Lee, who is based. He's the son. He's based off of the Robin Hood legends. You have the Beggar Knight. You have Sir Richard of the Lee. That's the knight who, in the story, Robin lends money to because his son is being held for ransom. That's what they said in the original ballad. And in my version, you have the same thing. You have Richard of the Lee, who is being lent money for his son, Thomas, who is being held for ransom in the Holy Land. So then we meet Thomas. We realize that he's gone through as a prisoner of war many of the horrors of prisoner of war conditions and the trauma that he's left with from the the truly horrible side of the crusading experience. If again one was captured, and the fate of captured prisoners on both sides was not terrific. So we get to see that through through his experience, and he eventually is going to cross paths with Al-Kashif, which makes it interesting because they both have the POW experience. So there's a lot. It's a lot of different characters doing different things. We do also run into Guy of Gisborne, who in this version is a deputy of the sheriff, and he has his own background story of trying to get basically get patronized by some powerful lord because he's an illegitimate son of a noble and some innkeeper's daughter. So he's struggling to find his way in the midst of all of that. So there's a lot of different characters, a lot of different situations, and Friar Tuck is also involved. He also turns out to be illegitimate in this universe, making it very difficult for him to have pursued holy orders. But he eventually is taken under the wing of Hugh of Lincoln, who's actually a saint, Saint Hugh of Lincoln. And he ends up finally getting into the priesthood. He's considered to be an outsider because of his illegitimate background. And so that kind of enables him to have this liminal role in the story. And also because he's half of Norman background, half of Saxon background too. So there's that goes in as well. So yeah, there's loads of other characters, loads of other subplots. It's one of those stories that's been running a long time for me because, as you say, Robin Hood was one of my first loves that I fell in love with when I was like 5, 6. And then it proliferated in terms to my love of all things England and wider Britain and so forth. So it's sort of a dream project for me in terms of just retelling the story again. It's one of those things where the story has been retold so many times. It's just kind of a privilege to be able to do it again and feel like you're kind of tapping into the history of it all too. It's quite something when you think of it that way.
Yeah, I've heard, I can't remember who the composer was. It might have been Stravinsky who said that, like, this masterful composer Stravinsky, but he said he looked at all of his work as just, a few notes in that grand tapestry of all the songs that have ever been sung. So I think that's a wonderful thing to be a part of, and we will include it, of course, in the notes descriptions below. And maybe just to finish up the conversation, kind of circling back around, we eventually, as you were saying, we see Richard's absence from England being a part of the narrative. And you had kind of given us some of the context of where that is deriving from and how it plays into sort of the idea of the return of the king and whatnot. But would you just kind of maybe speak briefly about like this idea of, one, I guess Richard taking up the cross, his return, and then because by the time that Richard enters in, by the time that Richard would enter into the Robin Hood narrative later, as any Anglophile would know, the cross of St. George has sort of become the identifier of to be English, and how maybe that ties into it as well.
Sure. I love this story, and it's something that honestly I've put into the Rev War story too, because it is really interesting. Like the Union flag, as it stands now, is such a unique banner in all of the different European flags. I love it. It's truly one of the few that contains crosses, and it's very explicitly Christian banner. Because of course you have the main design is an overlay of the flag, the cross of St. George and the cross of St. Andrew, representing the union between England and Scotland. And then eventually they did add in a cross of St. Patrick as well for Ireland when that occurred, and it still kind of represents Northern Ireland. But the main design being the overlay of George and Andrew. But yeah, so originally that color scheme and the idea of the red cross over white came from the Crusader jackets, essentially the tunics that they would wear. So it was white, for purity, represented by red for martyrdom, the red cross. And this is how they would be describing the fighting. You can see it within Richard's own description of the fighting. He saw it as a form of martyrdom. The fighting, and this is the same way. Of course, you see Muslims talking about it too. All of these guys, they're very interesting. They're very similar to each other. You see these very similar in a lot of ways descriptions in the crusading era of the idea of dying as a martyr, if you will, for the given kind of holy cause. So with the cross, it at first is just supposed to represent, just the idea of Christ, crucifixion, the red cross, and the idea of martyrdom. So you're imitating Christ, purity and martyrdom, kind of the idea. Then, though, how it gets associated with St. George particularly is he's the soldier saint, even though, like, technically at the end, like, you have the notion that he kind of technically wasn't a soldier at the tail end, but he was considered the soldier saint regardless. So Richard had a deep devotion to him. Now, up to this point, the patron saint of England was St. Edmund the Martyr, who I love. And I could go on forever about how much I love Edmund the Martyr. But, he had been the patron saint. You had some other claimants as well, like St. Alban, who was considered the proto-martyr of England. Sorry, the proto-martyr of Britain. There we go. The proto-martyr of all of Britain. And he was one of the first to die, to be martyred, it was believed, under the persecution by Diocletian, right? So he was proto-martyr, and then you had Edward the Confessor was another sort of claimant to the title as a patron saint, the saintly king and so forth. But Richard is the one who really makes George popularized, because he has this deep devotion to the soldier saint as a soldier king himself. So he connects with him. And he recounted that he believed he had a vision of St. George in, Palestine while fighting during a battle, that he sees, St. George come in, sort of a ghostly figure, if you will, on a white charger, and he leads the troops, the crusade troops, to victory. And this is the belief that Richard had, that he had prayed to St. George, and St. George manifested himself and showed him how to win this battle, essentially, and aided him in the winning of this battle. So now George becomes, through Richard, the royal patron saint. So now the kings of England are going to identify George as their helper, their patron. And the cross now, the banner, right, the crusading banner that has now developed, the idea of which was based off, again, it's the Paschal banner. So if you look at, like, for example, the Paschal lamb imagery, you see the resurrection banner, the Paschal banner, it's white with a red cross over it. That's what it's supposed to represent. But now, because of this story and because of this devotion that the king has, it starts to be gradually referred to as the cross of St. George. So it's tying into not only the crucifixion of Christ, but of this martyr, George, who the king has this particular connection to. And of course, there's all these legends, medieval golden legends about George battling a dragon and so forth to rescue a princess and causing them to convert, the village to convert, so they wouldn't have to sacrifice maidens to the dragon, and all of these romances of chivalry that were built up. So and that is such a Richard thing too. I mean, you see, Richard really was, this is what's awesome about Richard. He really loved the romances. So to become a figure of the romances himself, he wrote the romances. I'm just like, that's awesome in its way. As an author myself, it warms my heart. So he ends up sort of again making this now the cross of Saint George, and that sticks, where it becomes, the symbol of England after a while because of Richard. And that, goes down through the history, where it starts to just be the English flag, be the representation of England. And that's, quite cool, I think. And as an aside, the flag of St. Andrew, the Scottish one, is supposed to represent the X-shaped cross in which St. Andrew was executed, and which basically when his bones were brought to Scotland, it's believed, or some of his relics, a cloud essentially formed into the shape of an X in the blue sky, and that's how, and they knew this is where we're going to place the relics, and so that was how that design got done, and that's how you get the crossover happen with regards to the Union Jack, Union flag design. And so all of that is just really, really interesting, deeply Christian heritage that England and Britain has. It always makes me a little bit sad when you start to think about all of this deep heritage that they have that's been sort of jettisoned in this sort of downward spiral of losing themselves through losing God. So it's like they've lost God and their own identities, their own pride in the things that they should be taking pride in. So it's all rather sad. But yeah, last thing I think with Richard, I was just thinking, yeah. So Richard, of course, he was, again, this poetic figure, but the way that he got in the romances, he wrote them, and he would collaborate with troubadours, but one of the stories that is told about how Richard got his name, legend, is that when he is imprisoned by his own former allies, after he had some tuffles with them and being held for ransom, he ends up romancing the jailer's daughter. And then, they decide, can't have that. So they unleash a lion at him, which was being kept in the dungeon as well. Because those castles and keeps were sometimes used as zoos as well, like the Tower of London was, and some of these other places. They would keep these exotic animals that were purchased for the kings or whatever. And so the legend goes they unleash this lion at Richard, and Richard fights the thing with his bare hands and kills the thing, and then eats the thing's heart, and makes some joke about, if only there was salt. So that was one of the ways in which legend has it he's gained this, or he at least finalized the idea of, Coeur de Leon. So there was that, and then the other bit of the legend was, and this is the part that makes it into Gentleman Johnny's play about Richard, is the story of how his troubadour comes looking for Richard to try to find him, and how he does so is he plays and he sings a song that Richard and he wrote together underneath the various windows of the, I guess now I'm thinking, I'm like, okay, yeah, so if in the story Richard is like wrestling a lion in the interior dungeon, now all of a sudden he's up in whatever. Maybe they moved him after the lion incident. He's supposed to be up now. Now he's up on the top floor. And so, this troubadour is playing a song that the two of them wrote together under some windows, walking the building, and Richard starts singing to it from out the window. And so this is how the troubadour knows that he's alive and where he is, so that if they're going to pay to, get him free, they know they're not paying for a dead man. They were afraid, what if they killed him or he just died from conditions and we're going to pour all this money into it. Oh well, he's still out up there. He would know this hot number, and so that that made it into Gentleman Johnny's play, and so yeah. There's countless Richard stories. Oh, and the last one on it would be his final story as he goes to war in French territorial wars again. He goes fighting in France and he gets shot by an arrow, and eventually there's complications with the wound and he dies. But beforehand, because as you mentioned, there's this thing of conscience. This is why I'm bringing this up. This thing of chivalric consciousness of you're trying to be better than you are. And Richard, he had issues with both temper and his passions in general when it came to women, when it came to getting angry at people, when it came to violence, quite frankly. I mean, he certainly could do some pretty hot-blooded stuff all the way around. So he basically, towards when he knows he's dying, though, he pardons the kid who shot him, and basically says, I don't want him killed. The kid turns out being killed quite ruthlessly by some of Richard's men after the king is dead. But I think we should give it to Richard. He didn't want that. He actually said, I don't want to die in blood. I want to die having pardoned someone. I want to forgive my enemies before I die. Because he wasn't too good at that all the way up to that point. So he's sort of like, look, I want to go out on a high note, okay? So I want to forgive him. But so that I think was a very positive element of Richard's exit, was that he at least tried to do that. So that was the chivalry part. That's the knighthood part that was coming out strong in that. And I think that's a good close for his story.
Yeah, and it's all of these from Richard to Saladin to Arthur to Robin Hood, and I mean this is like we're in the English speaking world, so I guess we're going to be biased as it is anyways. But I think objectively, this is just a wonderful time for those of us that love history. There's just a wealth of things to draw from the historical, whether your venture into history is just to look for as objective truths as you could find, you're still going to find a very interesting history and a wellspring to draw from. Or if you're interested just in the storytelling that takes place, you have an almost endless supply of just wonderful tales that are at your disposal for this entire period, which, as we've mentioned, Avellina has herself added to. So we will keep all of the links for your works in the description. So I recommend everybody go check it out. I do appreciate you taking the time. We made quite a conversation out of it, and we knew we were going to.
We knew we were going to.
Like, well, we kind of magically stayed within the time frame too, and it's still so much to talk about. So it's just I think adds to what I'm saying here is just there's so much wonder about this particular period. Yeah.
Absolutely. I also wanted to just mention to everyone, last time I was on the program, I mentioned that I was about to release my second poetry book, Torn by Grace. It is now out. So it is available along with my first poetry book, Pendragon's Shield. Both are there, along with the novels, Saplings of Sherwood and Gone for a Soldier, and my anthologies are also there. So all of that can be found just on my Amazon page, just with my name. So all of that is there, and working on sequels for both of the projects. So that's that will eventually get us there. Eventually will get us there.
So guys, just keep an eye out for that. Once you've picked up these works that she's already had out, just keep an eye out for the subsequent works that'll be coming out. I'm sure we'll have you back on to discuss some more of this anyway. So anyways, awesome. Thank you, Avellina. God bless.
Thank you again so much, Brian. Really enjoyed it. God bless.